My friends, what is the weirdest country on Earth? Where do people live the most backwards and upside down lives compared to the rest of the world? And how, for that matter, do people survive living in a country that at many times has been described as being less free than North Korea? Well, for those of you who've joined us here today, we're going to be discovering that as we go and travel into the Central Asian nation of Turkmenistan. We're going to describe what it's like living in a landlocked and truly bizarre country. Because, oh my god, is this insane? But to tell the story, we're going to need to tell some context. Hey everyone, Sakuya here, and before we get back to the episode, I just want to thank each and every person that went on my trip to Italy here with me and my wife, because I had a ton of fun with you all. Whether it was going to the Roman Colosseum, whether it was exploring the forums, whether it was going to all these different things, it was an absolute blast, and I cannot wait to see more of you in future trips. One of the things that I love, perhaps more than anything else about this job, is specifically that I get to go to places and meet with people all over the world. That's something that I've always enjoyed. And for anyone who's watching this right now, it would make my world if you would join me at the German Christmas markets that I will be leading a trip to here come this November. We are going to see the Christmas markets in Munich, in Salzburg, and Vienna. We are also going to see castles. We're going to see all kinds of different sites, and even beyond that, just the base trip, we're also going to be going and doing a little bit of exploring around and seeing other things with some people while we're there. Honestly, when you go on one of these trips, it's really nice because you don't typically have to worry about planning anything. From having a guide who speaks the local language to be able to take you around, from your hotel accommodations being taken care of while you're there. And in general, the fun of going to places in a group, it's not something that I can really describe. It's just something that you have to experience for yourself. There's only a limited amount of spots, so if you want to join me on this trip to Germany, you only have to put 25% down if you book it now. And beyond that, there are payment plans moving forward in order to make things easier for people. Obviously, at different points, I'm going to do more random meetups with people, but if you want to go on a dedicated trip with me, this is your chance. Thank you, everyone. Now back to the show. I'm sure that for many people who are watching this video right now, you have probably never considered Turkmenistan. Yes, you may be familiar with it on a map, or at least the name, but you don't really know much about it. Turkmenistan is the second largest state in Central Asia, this being after Kazakhstan, and it is the southernmost of the region's 5 different republics. It is bordered by Kazakhstan to the northwest, Uzbekistan to the north and east, Afghanistan to the southeast, Iran to the south, and the Caspian Sea to the west. The interesting thing to note here, though, is that although Turkmenistan is the second largest country in Central Asia in terms of land area, most of the land consists of oases scattered amidst otherwise uninhabitable desert. It's not exactly, as I said from this, the most habitable place in the first place. As for why that is the case, well, Turkmenistan's position deep inside Asia and the character of its relief are responsible for a strongly continental climate, which exhibits great fluctuation in temperatures during the day and at pretty much any time during the year. The average annual temperature is only around 57 to 61 degrees Fahrenheit, which for many people who are looking at this right now, they go, hey, yeah, that doesn't sound too bad, until you realize that this figure goes and masks an extremely wide range that gives a very unlikely average. The temperature seldom falls below 95 degrees Fahrenheit during summer days, and in a number of different areas, even in the shade, will reach up to 122 degrees Fahrenheit, which is very hot. By contrast, in order to give those lower averages that we talked about, the temperature in Saparmurat, in the extreme south on the border with Afghanistan, drops to around 27 degrees Fahrenheit. Precipitation will then occur mostly in spring and would range from around 3 inches per year in the Northwest Desert to as much as 12 inches in the mountains. But really, that's about it. It's a hot or freezing hellhole the majority of the time. When talking about the population of Turkmenistan, Turkmens make up more than 4/5 of the republic's population, up from around 3/4 at the end of the 20th century and about 2/3 in 1970, largely because during this time there was a relatively high birth rate. There are a smaller number of Russians, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, and Tartars that live there, but the overwhelming majority of the country are Turkmens. Hence where the name Turkmenistan even comes from in the first place. Going further into demographics, there's another very interesting thing that we have to bring up when talking about this because it is very relevant when talking about politics. The vast majority of people in Turkmenistan are Muslim, mostly Sunni of the Hanafi school of Islam. Now, Islam among the Turkmens has a notable tradition of actually being quite tempered and also being infused with folk practices and local traditions. The government promotes secularism, or at least no distance from hardline Islamic thought, and keeps tight control over senior Muslim clergy members in the country, and more fundamentalist interpretations of Islam are suppressed. This means that on its own, Islam in Turkmenistan is largely more tolerant, and the second largest religion that you see in the region is Russian Orthodoxy. Going further into the demographics of the state, the population of Turkmenistan is young. And when I say young, I mean very young. More than half of the population is under the age of 30 years old. A high birth rate in the decades after independence would lead to a population boom. The birth rate has since decreased significantly since then, but it does remain higher than the global average. Life expectancy is about 74 years old for women and 68 for men, but really, when we're talking about this, the population of Turkmenistan is something that is highly debated by the government, as the government goes and claims that there is over 6 million people in the country. But we really don't know this because there have been censuses that have been done that show that like half the population has fled the totalitarian regime that rules the country, leaving only around 2.7 or so million people actually within it. Yeah, that's a little tidbit of what it is that we're going to be talking about here, but just imagine this. Imagine this where half of your country's population has fled. More juicy details are going to be coming. In terms of its economy, which is something that is definitely going to be relevant over the course of this video, and you will see why, Turkmenistan specializes in cotton growing and in the extraction of oil and natural gas. Turkmenistan's resources underground in the Western Plain and underwater along the Caspian Sea also include extensive reserves of oil and natural gas, as well as deposits of mirabolite, iodine, bromine, sulfur, potassium, and salt. Really, it is an area that is quite rich in precious resources. But among all these that modern states have a tendency to talk about, petroleum is the big one. Petroleum deposits and the associated oil industry are all centered in the Caspian Plain in western Turkmenistan and in the offshore oil fields in the Caspian Sea. Turkmenistan oil, among all things, when we've talked about low-grade oil that comes out of Venezuela, it is not that here. Turkmenistan oil is actually of a very high grade, both as a fuel and also as a raw material to be used for chemical production. A network of pipelines links natural gas deposits in western Turkmenistan with Ashgabat, Turkmenbashi, Chelikin, and the central regions of the republic. In December of 2009, a 1,100-long-mile natural gas pipeline linking Turkmenistan with China was opened. It was largely funded by the China Development Bank as part of what would initially be the Belt and Road Initiative, which I already did a video about, so if you have not seen that, then definitely go back and check that out because it gets really complex with all the projects that they worked on here. Anyway, passing through Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, it was Turkmenistan's first high-volume export pipeline to completely circumvent Russia, which was a very big deal. Early then the following year, a new 19-mile pipeline between Turkmenistan and Iran was open, which would augment an older, smaller pipeline that continued to deliver to that country. Construction of a pipeline delivering natural gas from Turkmenistan to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, also known by the acronym TAPI, this is something that would begin in 2018. And largely, natural gas and oil and these kinds of resources that we just discussed, this is the thing that has driven Turkmenistan's economy over the course of the past decade or more. It is easily one of its most valuable resources, valuable anything to have. But in order to tell the story of how all of this goes to crap, we need to first talk about how this place even became a country in the first place. So, my friends, going back in history, until the year 1924, the Turkmens never really experienced even nominal political unity. That just really wasn't a thing. Their organization was exclusively tribal, and the tribes were either nomadic and independent, or subject to neighboring Persia, or to the Khanates of Khiva and Bukhara. This would change, however, when it would formally become one of the USSR's constituent republics in 1925. And during the Soviet period, Turkmenistan would benefit from educational and healthcare modernization, but also, at the same time, considering the overarching reach of the Soviets, they would also experience a little bit of political repression, to say the least. However, political repression wasn't the most significant thing to take place in Turkmenistan during this time. No, instead, during the Soviet years, there was an earthquake that would strike near Ashgabat at 1:12 a.m. on October 6th, 1948. And if we were going to do an entire section or thing on this channel about disasters in history, this would easily be one. This was one of the strongest earthquakes in recorded history and measured a whopping 7.3 on the Richter scale. The earthquake would cause extreme damage in Ashgabat as well as nearby villages, and almost every single brick building collapsed. Concrete structures of any kind were heavily damaged, and freight trains were completely derailed. There was damage and casualties as far away as Iran. This thing was massive and wide-reaching. And when I say right now that the majority of brick buildings and things were destroyed, I mean basically all of them. And when I say basically all of them, I mean all but three. 3 buildings remained standing in the entire city after this was over. The loss of life was staggering in this time. Between 100,000 to 160,000 people were killed, equivalent to almost 10% of the entire Turkmen SSR population at the time. Every single hospital was destroyed, and so medical treatment had to be rendered on the municipal parade ground under the trees. In all of this chaos, there would appear a young boy, one who was only 8 years old, and he was actually found alive. His entire family had been killed during the quake, and so because of this, he ended up becoming a ward of the state. But the reason that we bring this individual up is because he would manage to survive. And in surviving and in being raised within the Soviet Union, he would become an ardent member of the Soviet Communist Party. Little did anyone know that this boy is the one who would go on to influence the entire course of his country's development more than anyone could possibly imagine. So fast forward a little bit of time, and in 1985, that young orphan that we talked about from Ashgabat was made into the president of the Turkmen Soviet Socialist Republic by Mikhail Gorbachev. The name of this individual that we neglected to mention before was Saparmurat Niyazov, which in turn I am probably butchering the pronunciation of, so for that I apologize. But regardless of that, this individual was extremely important. The new constitution that would be established would establish legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government. It would be dominated by a strong, singular executive. The president, who was the head of state, was to be elected for a maximum of 2 consecutive 5-year terms. But Turkmenistan's first president, our sweet little survival angel boy, Niyazov, well, he decided to extend his term to 10 years in a 1994 referendum. A People's Council that was made up of the president, members of the parliament, regional representatives, chairman of the high courts, the cabinet, and other officials all had the authority to call national referenda, plan economic and social policy, and declare war. Despite having significant de jure powers, the council, though, would end up largely functioning as a kind of rubber stamp for Niyazov's decisions, because whatever Niyazov said, Niyazov got. But okay, that is 1994. The republic itself would end up declaring independence on October 27th, 1991. Because as we've already talked about here earlier several times in different videos, we all know what was happening to the Soviet Union during this time period. And as such, the SSR state, or former state, would now adopt the name of Turkmenistan. In addition to this new name, Turkmenistan would also adopt a new constitution in 1992, replacing the Soviet-era constitution that had been in effect since 1978. This is all well and good, but in the early years of independence, a corrupt regime led by the dictatorial rule of Niyazov, well, that failed to actually improve the quality of life for the population. This being, interestingly enough, despite the fact that there was massive amount of foreign interest and investors that were trying to invest resources into Turkmenistan's natural gas resources and production capabilities. I mean, this is the 90s after all, and oil and natural gas, that's where the money is. Yeah, if anyone is wondering how exactly he would even manage to stay in power in the first place, or how all of this would propagate, well, during the course of Niyazov's rule, his primary interest proved to be just trying to create an elaborate personality cult, something which put him at the center of everything in the state, and from that, the world. In addition to eventually declaring himself president for life, which he did, Niyazov pursued a number of very extravagant projects to this end. He even went and retitled himself as Turkmenbashi, which is the leader of the Turkmen, which I know for a number of people looking at this right now, they're thinking, okay, so the guy gave himself a new name. It's not really all that big of a deal. That's something that happens, right? It's not like, some of the more crazy ones that we've seen out of some African dictators. Well, my friends, that's where the projects come into play. Atop a monument called the Neutrality Arch, a golden statue in his likeness was built. One of the very many such statues and portraits that would be scattered throughout the country. This was something that was designed to rotate, to continuously face the sun. Yeah, that's right. This guy with a solid gold-looking statue wanted to constantly face the sun and shine his beacon of light over the world. In addition to that kind of gold, he also wanted a golden age lake, something that would be constructed in the desert of a cost of more than $6 billion, which is kind of a waste of money. Oh, and this is another thing. His semi-autobiographical book, Runama, or The Book of the Soul, this was something that was established as required reading in all of Turkmenistan schools. So he was getting his own little mouse-read book. During this time, Turkmenbashi had basically decided that he had a direct line with God, which is something that manifested in Runama. I want you to think of this essentially as a kind of watered-down version of Mein Kampf plus the Bible. And no, I'm not actually kidding about that. He would mandate the presence of Runama in mosques, threatening to demolish them for non-compliance. Niyazov also had a statue of Runama erected in Ashgabat. Every evening at 8 p.m., the statue's covers would open, accompanied by an audio passage of Runama being played for the citizens. And if anyone thinks, oh man, that there's no ways that something like that lasted, they would have definitely gotten rid of that at some point, right? No, that statue still remains in place today. You could go see it. The autocrat would even go and launch the book into space in August of 2005, aiming for its conquest beyond Earth's bounds. Even to this day, it is still there, and it is said to be orbiting the planet for the next 150 years. You have to understand that when talking about Turkmenistan, this book is so incredibly important to the state that at one point, you could not even get a driver's license in Turkmenistan without reading the Runama, because guess what? There were questions from it that were asked on the driver's test. So if you didn't know the answer, if you hadn't read the book, I mean, you weren't going to be allowed to drive. This man basically did a lot, but I can't even begin to describe half of the things that he went and did, so I'm just going to try and list some of them for you in the first place. Like especially renaming. He was incredibly popular when it came to renaming. And no, I'm not talking about being popular with the people. I mean, his name was popular. He renamed days of the week, of months of the year, a crater of the moon, a breed of horse, a canal, a city, and a wide range of places after himself and members of his family. He plastered his name everywhere. We're talking about a level of renaming, of trying to change language to such a degree that he even went and abolished the Turkmen word for bread and replaced it with something else. Can you guess it? Can you guess what it is? Is it his name? No, it's not his name. It was his mother's name. Gurban Sultan. He renamed bread after his mother. The actions of a mad dictator? Yes, but also strangely touching when we talk about this. And there are other kind of weird things as well in the first place that are strangely kind of positive, yet also overbearing at the same time. Like, as an example, in 1997, when he tried to go and quit smoking, he passed a law that banned it in public in order to eliminate the temptation. Not out of trying to save his people, not any kind of like health issue or crisis or anything like that. Just, hey, I want to ban smoking in public. I want to remove it so that way I won't be tempted to do it myself. It's like literally the government state level of trying to remove all the chocolate from your house so that you're not tempted to break your diet. And by virtue of that, you're making everyone else in your family suffer too. But of course, as I said, there's more. In addition to the other insane laws, there was way more renamings that would occur. Like, as an example, he renamed the month of January to be Turkmenbashi, which, if you remember from what we talked about here before, that was his own damn nickname. The next month, February, which is actually my birthday, is something that also would not manage to get away, as he would go and rename it as Flag. Yes, Flag. The reason why it was called Flag, as in like a flag waving in the sky, is because Turkmenistan's Flag Day is celebrated in February. Which is all, that's nice. It's good. It's okay. That's not fine. Somewhat understandable. But also, guess what? It just so happens to coincidentally be celebrated on Turkmenbashi's birthday. Because of course. He would also go and rename April after his mom, which is nice, but also confusing considering that is literally also now the name for bread. Even more oddly though, he would go and rename September to Runama after his divinely inspired somewhat life story. And he would also then go and rename December to Neutrality, as Turkmenistan is actually the only recognized entirely neutral country in the world, according to the UN, which I can already see the comments coming in right now. I know that someone in Switzerland is furious about me saying that last sentence. I get it. I guarantee you that that is something that has happened. I understand. But before I get banned from visiting Switzerland, since I literally plan on taking my wife there for her birthday here soon, please let me explain. Turkmenistan is the only country in the world that has been recognized as neutral by the United Nations. In 1995, all 185 members voted for Turkmenistan to remain neutral, and in celebration of this, an olive branch was added to the flag. But the bizarre name changes don't just stop there. In fact, you know what? While we're doing this, we should just go ahead and run through the days of the week real fast, as was renamed by Turkmenbashi, so you understand what I'm talking about, because it feels like every single time I say something about a renaming, there's 50 more things that I could also possibly be talking about. First up, Monday. Guess what? First day. All right, among all things, that makes sense. Okay, I'm not really displeased with that one. Second one, Tuesday, Youth Day. Which, among all things, like, why not reserve that for Friday? Like, I get the sentiment that you want something to celebrate the children, but in most cases, people are going to care about Friday significantly more, especially when talking about kids. Wednesday, Favorable Day, I guess. Thursday, Justice Day. Again, I don't know why. Friday, Mother Day. Which, on that note, here, I have to say this here. If you're talking about Youth Day and children that are going to school, there are many cases, and I know this as being a father myself, that it is a very joyous occasion when, on Monday, my daughter is able to go to school, and then I am able to actually get some work done. I love playing with her. I really do. But I'm pretty sure mothers also appreciate having a break. This brings us to Saturday, which is Spirit Day for some reason here. I'm assuming that the association is of a religious nature. And then Sunday is also, we could associate this with religion, Rest Day, which actually does kind of make sense. We already referred to Sunday oftentimes as a day of rest. So yeah, some of these things were a little bit weird. Some of them made kind of sense, but you have to understand that the renaming of things gets so crazy that you, who is watching this video right now, and I strongly encourage you to like the video, could travel to the city of Turkmenbashi. You could land at the Turkmenbashi airport. You could go down the Turkmenbashi highway, to stay at the Turkmenbashi hotel, to drink a bottle of liquor with guess whose picture on it? Oh yeah, Turkmenbashi. It's all coming together. Only to then wash down that drink with a nice piece of bread. Oh no, wait, I mean Turkmenbashi's mother. Anyway, my friends, we could go and talk about renaming for perhaps the entire rest of this episode, but that wouldn't really get into the nitty-gritty details of just how awful things are going to get within the country of Turkmenistan, and also how weird. Because, my friends, a large proportion of state money at the beginning of the 21st century, estimated at more than half of the country's gross domestic product, was funneled off to a special presidential fund. And much of this revenue was used to subsidize these special construction projects that would emphasize the president's prestige. Yes, my friends, this was state-sponsored embezzlement, the best kind of corruption, where it's not even just something that is being done illicitly, it is blatant that this is being done, and no one can do anything about it. Of course, this systemic diversion of revenue, as well as various different reforms that were instituted in the country, would result in a crippling decline in education as well as healthcare services, as the money was taken away to build giant golden statues. Anyway, this could not last forever. And in late 2006, after more than 2 decades of rule, the great and all-powerful Turkmenbashi would finally die suddenly of a heart attack. What is interesting to note is that fears that the absence of a designated successor would threaten the country's stability, these weren't immediately realized, though. In a surprising departure from the dictates of the country's constitution, the former Minister of Health, whose name I know for a fact that I'm going to butcher right now, Gurbanguly Berdymukhamedov, God dang it. Gurbanguly. We're referring to this guy as Gurbanguly. You can read the name here right here. Anyway, he is named as acting president. For the sake of everyone's sanity who is watching this, there's no way in hell I will be able to say that over and over again, so from now on I will be referring to him for the rest of this video as simply Birdie. Anyway, the country's first, and at least nominally contested elections, were held in February of the following year. And amidst widespread criticism that they were marred by fraud, Birdie, over there, was declared the winner and was formally inaugurated as Turkmenistan's new president. Now, when we go and talk about this guy and the overall decline of Turkmenistan over time, it's really interesting that this guy, prior to being the Minister of Health, he was a dentist. Not only was he just a dentist, he was Turkmenbashi's dentist. Yes, my friends, that is right. The dentist of the guy who ruled the country with an iron fist and rebuilt it in his image with his great smiling teeth had his dentist take over after him. Like, honestly, in terms of successions in history, I don't really think that there are many other examples of weirder ones. Like, truly, this is maddening. An authoritarian dictatorship was passed from the last Soviet leader of the country to the guy's dentist. I mean, really, guys. Anyway, early on in his presidency, Berdy would take steps towards dismantling the vestiges of Turkmenbashi's personality cult and reversing some of his more controversial orders. Adjustments included ending bans such as those that were on circuses, ballet, and opera, as well as reversing Turkmenbashi's decree that renamed the days of the week and months of the year after himself and other members of his family. In addition to this, he would order that the Neutrality Arch, with its large golden effigy, would be moved from the capital center to its southern suburbs. Also, the statue of Turkmenbashi no longer rotates to face the sun. It's not something that was practical anymore, and there was no reason to keep doing it. In addition to this, in 2013, Berdy would order the removal of Renama from all schools and universities. The old cult of Turkmenbashi was falling. So, now, a number of people who are probably watching this are thinking, okay, hey, great, so they just got rid of the old personality cult. That is awesome. It seems like he's implementing some really good reforms. Well, sort of. You see, my friends, soon after Berdy got rid of Turkmenbashi's personality cult, he replaced it with one of his own. Because of course. Except, in this case, instead of renaming months after himself and his relatives, which is way too personal, no, he renamed locations and institutions. Replacing Niyazov's much easier name to pronounce Ruknama, students began reading something else. Berdymukhamedov's Turkmenama, which is like the story of the Turkmen. In addition to reading material, he also would get himself into statues, and in 2015, a golden statue of Berdy was unveiled in central Ashgabat. Yeah, and you can probably guess where the money came in order to be able to build something like that. We talked about health services in Turkmenistan briefly, but an interesting thing to note about them is that they are free. They are free, but also they are very scarce. And at the same time, quality healthcare remains largely inaccessible. Medical facilities are largely underfunded, and therefore patients sometimes have to offer payment in order to actually receive certain services and medication. That's right, in a country with free healthcare, you had to bribe to get healthcare. In an effort to consolidate his power before, by 2005, Turkmenbashi had closed off all hospitals outside of the capital. However, rural hospitals were reopened by his successor, Berdy, although they continue to lack any essential equipment that they needed to actually provide care. That makes it all the more amazing that Turkmenistan would go on to claim a 0% death rate in their hospitals. Which you may wonder, for anyone who is watching this right now, how do you do this with understaffed, under-equipped, under-everything hospitals? There's no way that you would have a 0% death rate. Well, that's the trick. One of the more common things to occur in Turkmenistan is that anyone who is about to die, is sent back home, like ASAP. So long as you did not die in the hospital, that means that the hospital can continue to claim that, hey, we have 0 deaths. Like some kind of really early YouTuber playthrough of Dark Souls. The other really weird thing that we need to note about when talking about Turkmenistan's healthcare is that as time has gone on and more funding has been put into the hospitals, technically speaking, they have actually managed to acquire a number of different modern medical machines and tools. However, Turkmenistan refuses to send its doctors abroad to actually learn how to use its new machines. And so new machines in the hospital are mostly just there for decoration because they don't know how to use them. In addition to the fudged numbers that we've talked about before with healthcare, the Turkmen unemployment rate is equally impressive at 0%, although it is actually more than 60% of the country. And really the only way that the country has managed to survive at all is thanks to the black market. The overwhelming majority of the population keep their money in cash at home because there's simply no way that they can actually trust the bank or government with it. As for why that would be the case, well, just look at this from an employment perspective. Government servants, so in other words, bureaucrats and pretty much anyone who is involved in the public sector, this is claimed to be around 80% of the population. So 80% of the entire country works for the state, or supposedly works for the state. These are people who are obliged to subscribe to the daily newspaper featuring 6 pages covering what the president did the day before, usually relating to opening new schools, new highways, etc. Really, this is insane, but also any newspaper of any kind is required by law to have the state's portrait of the president displayed clearly on the front page. This photo is changed daily in order to ensure that the newspapers are paying attention and also following the guidelines of the state. Because of course. Going into education, compulsory primary and secondary education is provided for free for 12 years. Tertiary education is 5 years, and the state would run 24 institutions of higher education. With a literacy rate exceeding 99% of the population, literacy is virtually universal. Or, again, as we've talked about with other rates in here, so the government claims. In terms of resources, since 1993, the people of Turkmenistan have been given free water, electricity, and gas. This was a rule that was brought by Turkmenbashi, who introduced subsidies for the people, and it's interesting to note that every single person was allotted 25 kilowatts of electricity, 50 cubic meters of natural gas, and 250 liters of water every month. In addition to that, in 2008, President Berdy would go and add a new subsidy, giving 120 liters of fuel to every individual every month. As you can probably imagine from everything that I've listed here, this is actually quite a lot. And the weird thing is that given that there was an abundance of natural gas in Turkmenistan, people never went and switched off the gas in their homes. Oftentimes, it was just cheaper to let the gas burn than actually spend money getting matchboxes to light the gas every time they had to use it. They could just let it burn constantly, leading to massive amounts of waste. Oh, and all those perks for living in an energy production-based country that I just mentioned? Yeah, that's how it used to be. Locals used to have state-subsidized gas, water, petrol, and electricity between 1993 and 2019. And the government happened to just take that away right before the pandemic hit. Which, as you can imagine, had a lot of consequences. Berdy was elected to a second 5-year term as president in February of 2012. And although the ballot was generally regarded as fraudulent, there wasn't really anything that anyone could do about it. It was just accepted. In December, Turkmenistan would hold a parliamentary election that was billed as the first to feature multiple political parties. But in reality, the political process remained under the government's tight control. Only parties with official recognition participated in the election, and individual candidates were also carefully screened to ensure their loyalty to Berdy. Fast forward a little bit of time, and in late 2015, work would begin on a pipeline that would allow Turkmenistan to export its extensive natural gas resources to Afghanistan, to Pakistan, and to India. This so-called Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, which is the long name, the TAPI pipeline, was expected to stretch around 1,125 miles and to be operational by the end of 2019. The problem is, when talking about literally any kind of mega project whatsoever, is that when constructing something of such a massive scale, usually things end up getting delayed, and this is precisely what happened. The pipeline construction ended up getting far behind schedule, and by 2022, only of a section of the pipeline stretching from Turkmenistan into western Afghanistan had actually been done. But anyway, in February of 2016, a commission that was headed by Berdy went and drafted amendments to the Constitution that would increase the length of a presidential term from 5 to 7 years and would remove the upper age limit of the president, which before had been set at 70. Yes, that's right, my friends. For anyone who's been listening to this now, Turkmenistan actually had a rule in their government that if you were over the age of 70, you could not be elected. I already know. I know what the comment section is going to look like when talking about that here. I understand. Remember that expression about a broken clock. Anyway, observers generally saw the amendments, which went into effect just months before the presidential election was scheduled for February of 2017, as further evidence that Berdy intended to hold the presidency for life. And as expected, Berdy won a 7-year term in 2017 with 98% of the vote. Let me repeat that for you. 98%. Now, typically the margin of error when talking about things statistically is around 1 or 2% for election results. This is generally what would happen, which means that every single breathing person of voting age is probably have claimed to have voted for Berdy, which, as people are aware, is basically impossible. But that all being said, Berdy would continue to rule. Though, interestingly enough, after an unexpected absence from public in 2019, rumors would begin to swirl about the state of Berdy's health. After all, he was getting up there in age, and things weren't necessarily looking so good for him. So, this brings up a very interesting question then. How was the state going to respond? What are they going to do to prove that he is all well and good, that he is fully functioning, that he is a proper member of society? Maybe a nice long speech? Maybe something where he is just seen out in public talking to the people? No, the state goes and posts a half-hour-long video of Berdy doing varying different activities, like working out and driving donuts around the gates of hell. Which, for anyone who has not seen this here, that's a whole other thing in and of itself, of a disaster in history of something that was done, or a dumb event in history. The gates of hell is Turkmenistan's constantly burning 50-year-old pit of fire in the remote desert. That fire was actually started by the Russians back in the 70s when a natural gas rig collapsed and caught on fire, and despite numerous attempts to put it out, that is still something that burns to this very day. It has been burning for like 6 decades. But either way, the man is all well and good. The video proves that, I guess. Sort of. It's at this point that Berdy's son, Serdar, begins to take on a number of different public positions. And in 2021, he gets appointed to the post of Deputy Prime Minister. That same year, an upper chamber was created for the legislature. Berdy would end up becoming its chair, and this in turn would allow him to retain a post-presidential political role. In February of 2022, Berdy would announce that an early presidential election was going to be held in March, and that he was not going to be running. He was willingly stepping down. A huge move, as you can probably imagine, but for anyone who's been watching this and listening to what I've been talking about, you know exactly what is coming next. His son, Serdar's candidacy, was announced merely days later, and he would win the election with more than 70% of the vote and would take office as president only a week later. Now, my friends, we have a political dynasty. For anyone who's been watching this so far, you understand well and good that this is obviously not a democracy, and you may wonder, how will the people react to any of this that is going on within their country? How do they deal with any of this? Well, to keep information from the outside world hidden from its citizens, Turkmenistan, one of the world's most closed off and isolated countries in the first place, it exercises almost total control over the internet. Getting around this ban is incredibly difficult. It is really no small feat. Some people will manage to connect to a VPN, but honestly, that is something that is only temporary, as it will also be blocked eventually. Still though, despite the effectiveness of the Turkmen firewall, the regime is constantly stepping up measures to prevent outside information from seeping into the nation. Berdy Jr. would go and announce in 2023 his intention to, quote, strengthen the country's cybersecurity. Alongside social media, services like WhatsApp, Viber, Signal, and Telegram are also blocked. Instead, Turkmenistan has a service called Bizbard, which is a local messenger under the government's control, and really the only other alternatives that existed were the absolutely ancient ICQ messenger and another local messenger service, which were then rendered completely obsolete by the government's firewalls over time. And as for how videos would work, well, the authorities went and launched a service called Belit, which is a YouTube alternative that is purged of any kind of content, whether that is news, entertainment, anything that could show what life is like beyond the isolated country's borders. Really, there is no media landscape. That is not something that exists. The Turkmen population would continue to see nothing but propaganda in order to be able to promote the cult of personality of Berdy and his son. In order to prevent this parallel reality that was created by the media from collapsing, the rulers of the state have to block the internet and all media outlets inside the country that are not state-owned. They only broadcast official news, they only report heavily on people offering their praise, and also thanks to the Berdy regime. That is it. Television does also exist, but it's boring. It's not informative. It's the same shows run over and over and over again from local productions and things that praise the government. That's really it. There isn't anything else that is there. Meanwhile, as all of this happens within the society of Turkmenistan, Berdy Sr. is still actually quite popular, if you want to believe that, considering that the entire country is essentially brainwashed. Also known as Arkadag, which means the protector, he travels the country spreading his influence. The Arkadag newspaper, which is named in his honor, recently reported that Gurban Gully traveled to Arkadag, a town named in his honor, to congratulate the players of the local football team, who were also named Arkadag, in his honor. We're just continuing with the naming tradition over time, in case you haven't seen this. It sounds absolutely peachy, but unfortunately for the people of Turkmenistan, behind the carefully controlled headlines lies a country with a bleak human rights record. The Freedom House NGO ranks Turkmenistan as among the worst of the worst for political freedoms and civil liberties, as it scores just 2 out of 100 possible points in this ranking. Mind you, is actually lower than North Korea. Turkmenistan is also at the bottom of Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index every single year, and the local news never contains any critical articles or negative information according to its locals. It just doesn't exist. There were and continue to be many bizarre laws and practices in this country, and we are going to go over all of them. But first, we're going to need to touch on something that is, honestly, I don't really know where else to begin when talking about this video here and talking about all the things that this guy did, or really the whole state did. Because one of these weird laws is that the government banished all dogs from the capital, because Turkmenbashi did not like the way that they smelled. Animal cruelty, for anyone who cares about that, is bad enough, but then he would go on to order all stray animals be disposed of, which you can imagine what that means. According to these former workers, officials at public utility companies would issue a quota of animals to be killed and demand that employees implement a special plan to carry out the killings, which usually involve poisonings, starving, or beating the animals to death. Others are just shot. In order to meet this quota, household pets could also be targeted, which is why if you see a dog in Turkmenistan, then that is something that would most likely be behind a fence and chained to a person's property. If any workers would protest against the order, then they would be threatened by their bosses. Those who refused to carry out the killings would also then sometimes be made to pay people who were willing to kill the animals, with managers deciding how much should be paid for the job according to former workers. As an example of this, recounting an incident from several years ago, shortly before a presidential visit was to take place, a worker from Turkmenabat would explain how he was ordered by the deputy mayor to kill 2 dogs. Quote, "People approached the dogs from 4 sides, including the deputy mayor. I refused to participate, explaining that I was just a forklift operator and janitor. Then, the dogs were brutally beaten to death, and there was blood everywhere on the road. The corpses were loaded onto our vehicle. My boss and the deputy mayor then threatened that they would talk to me after work." After leaving his job and then starting work at a landfill site, this same worker that we're talking about would note how dead dogs and cats were brought in cars constantly. Quote, "There was a watchman who supervised the whole process. He had a book in which he recorded how many dogs and cats each car brought. Even if the animals were still living, they were buried alive with the supervisors not caring that they were whining." Initially used as a means to exterminate the rapidly increasing animal populations after thousands of residential buildings were demolished in the Turkmen capital, the slaughtering of animals would then spread to other regions. Roundups would often intensify in the run-up to important state and government events, such as a visit by the authoritarian president, Berdy Jr., or his father, Berdy Sr. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of all of these different incidents here because there are many personal stories specifically talking about these events. If you want to look them up, then by all means, after this video is over, feel free to go and do so. I'm not going to ask you to feel miserable because it's going to be like one of those late night commercials that you'd see back in the early 2000s with the Sarah McLachlan song coming on singing about angels while sad images of dogs cross you. And so anyway, these incidents that we're talking about here would occur despite a state law adopted in July of 2022 against animal cruelty. It even included a provision that regulating the population of stray dogs should be carried out by, quote, "methods that exclude cruelty and unnecessary suffering." This whole thing is weird because at the same time, somehow, the presidential administration takes great pride in its own native dog, the Alibi. In 2020, Berdy would unveil a 6-meter-tall golden statue of an alibi dog in Ashgabat and would designate the last Sunday of April 21st a national holiday dedicated to the Central Asian breed. His son, Serdar, the guy who's taking over for things, he presides over the Turkmen Alibi International Association, which is amazing that it can even say that it has a international association considering everything we've talked about. But yeah, in 2021, the power to confer the honorary titles of, quote, distinguished dog breeder and people's dog breeder, these were granted to the president. Because of course they were. And my friends, if you thought that things were over because we were talking about animal cruelty now, then you are wrong. In addition to everything that we've already talked about, regional officials and employees of local state entities in Turkmenistan's western regions of Balkan have been forced to buy watches with pictures of President Berdy Jr. and his father on the face of the timepieces. Sources report that the watches would cost anywhere between 1,500 and 3,000 manats, or $410 to $820, with those of higher ranks being obliged to buy the more expensive watches, while the less expensive editions were for lower-tier employees of state entities. Despite the fact that Turkmenistan is rich in natural resources such as natural gas and oil, this is something that hits its people particularly hard when forced to do these kinds of actions because the majority of its population has been living in poverty for years. And really, there's not much that they can do. Old wooden benches that dot the courtyards of many Soviet-era apartment buildings in the Turkmen capital have long been meeting points where neighbors would gather to chat or get fresh air. But authorities in Ashgabat are removing the benches and depriving locals of one of the most popular spots that they would use for socializing. A municipal worker who spoke to reporters on the condition of anonymity would say that one of the reasons was to prevent the people from gathering in large numbers, something that you could not have in an authoritarian state. In 2020, the authorities would launch a similar campaign and remove benches and tables from the courtyards in residential areas across the city. In addition to that control, in the past, authorities have removed satellite dishes and old air conditioning units on the exteriors of apartment buildings, and also ordered the residents to not dry their laundry on the balconies. This being because they want things to look pretty and uniform and perfect. For some, though, it's even harsher, because residents of Turkmenistan's western province of Balkan can also be arrested if they leave their homes after 9 p.m. The unofficial nighttime curfew was imposed by the police earlier this year in the coastal province, where state employees can lose their job if they breach the new rule. Citizens are also often forcibly sent to rehabilitation centers or subjected to mandatory tests. And if you think that that is dark, well, just wait for this one. Female high school students in Turkmenistan's coastal province of Balkan are also subjected to mandatory virginity tests, in which officials say that they are needed in order to evaluate the teenagers' morality. As you can imagine from that, authorities did not exactly seek consent from either the teenagers or their parents. And for any students who failed the test, well, they are reported to police and security services. If you're even wondering how some of these things would be done in the first place, police would often check the cell phones of girls on the list in order to seek information about their suspected sexual partners. No public explanation was ever offered by the government on why the gynecological tests were being carried out, but the Balkanabat-based worker who provided the information suspects that tests are linked to a reported rise in teenage pregnancies in the province in recent months. According to this individual that the report comes from, 6 such cases were recorded just in Balkanabat. So they were doing all of this, everything that I've been talking about here, because 6 women got pregnant. That's right, 6 people. That's it. And mind you, this is not the only place in Turkmenistan where this is occurring. In 2018, police and security officers accompanied by gynecologists would conduct unannounced raids, which again sounds so weird that gynecologists are conducting raids, but they would do so at schools in the northern Dashagaz region. The officers would check male students' mobile phones for adult videos, while female students were rounded up in order to undergo virginity tests in the school's nurse's office. If any girls during this time were discovered to not be virgins during the tests, then their parents were summoned and then they were shamed in front of everyone at the entire school. Of course, people are not going to take all of this laying down. And in March of 2023, police would end up detaining 30 women who had gathered outside of the presidential palace in the capital of Ashgabat in order to raise their concerns about police corruption directly with the president, having failed to get their complaints addressed by local and regional authorities. These women were taken to the police station, denied access to food and water for over the course of 6 hours, and were then forced to sign official statements of their detention before being released. A month later, police would go and detain 15 people following spontaneous protests by hundreds of demonstrators against bread shortages at a local bread factory in the city of Mari. Police would use unnecessary and disproportionate force in order to break up protesters that were blocking traffic on a main road. And also, in addition to everything that I have talked about here so far, do you remember how I talked about earlier with Turkmenistan reporting that they had a 0% unemployment rate? Well, every year, thousands of public sector workers are seasonally forced to participate in the cotton harvest, this being year after year after year, or just pay for others to be able to replace them. Women were particularly affected by this as they make up most of the public sector workforce. The government continued to reject all claims that forced labor was being used systemically, but in September, it would allow medical doctors and qualified teachers in 3 districts to stop working in the cotton fields without the need to pay for replacements. It's absolutely insane. And you may wonder, well, why? Why would they need the entire public sector out there literally picking cotton? Why would that have to happen? And then you remember, from the beginning, with the census issue, that it is possible that the state has lost half the population that they previously had. And so that obviously means that there's a lot of people who need to do the work of people who no longer exist. But okay, I know that this video is all over the place and we are going into a lot of different topics in here. I understand that. But the thing that we're going to be moving on to here right now with Turkmenistan is that we're going to need to go and look at some of the more bizarre laws and strange things that the government has imposed on its people, as well as some very odd records that the country has managed to attain over the years. Because boy, oh boy, does this get wild. You see, Turkmenistan has been on something of a record-busting drive for years now. In 2021, Guinness would give its seal of approval to the largest carpet in the world, which measured at 301 square meters and weighed around 1,200 kilograms. Carpets hold such prominence in Turkmenistan that there is a Ministry of Carpet in the government. That's how big of a deal this is. There is also a National Carpet Museum in Ashgabat with more than 1,000 carpets on display. Moreover, there is also a carpet on the national flag of Turkmenistan. That is a thing. Fast forward a little bit of time, and in 2008, it was the world's largest flagpole, measuring 133 meters tall, although multiple countries have now since surpassed this. In 2010, the Oguz Khan 67-acre fountain complex, which comprised of 27 cascades, was recognized as the largest of its kind. And for another record that few people probably ever knew actually existed, Turkmenistan last year secured the prize for world's largest architectural representation of a star, which forms the body of a 211-meter tall Ashgabat television center. It's a lot. In 2016, the Central Asian nation would earn another spot in the record books for the world's largest Ferris wheel in an enclosed space. Not a law, but a fun fact. Did you know that in Turkmenistan, there is a day that is dedicated to melons? And no, we're not talking about one of those stupid little things that you see of like National Hot Dog Day or anything like that. No. Every second Sunday of August is celebrated as National Melon Day, and it also has a public holiday. Turkmenistan actually produces some of the best and juiciest melons in the world, and this is something that they take pride in. Ashgabat, the capital of Turkmenistan, would make a significant mark in 2013 by entering the Guinness Book of World Records, where the city would earn this distinction for its impressive collection of 543 white marble buildings, spanning an area of 4.5 million square meters, and guess what? Most of these buildings were uninhabited. But hey, they had a record for pretty white buildings. Moving on to another aspect about the state, in 2018, Birdie Jr. would rename the Gates of Hell as the Shining Star of Karakum. However, 4 years later, he would end up reversing that decision and ordered his cabinet ministers to find a way to close the fiery crater, with his reason being, you may wonder, that the crater was causing negative health effects and also it was causing damage to the environment. Yeah, no, that didn't actually end up working out. This very iconic fire is still open and still accessible to visitors to this day. Another unusual decree that was put out here was by former President Birdie, and that was his policy regarding cars within the capital city of Ashgabat. For one, dirty cars are not permitted. You can't have anything that is filthy. As a result, numerous car washing stations are situated in the city's outskirts to enable residents to clean their vehicles before they enter. But on top of that, you're only going to see the same color of car pretty much everywhere it is that you go, because only white cars are allowed to enter the city of Ashgabat. All cars of any other color have been banned from driving within it. Yes, you will see the occasional gray or beige car, which is from another city. However, no other color of vehicles are visible in the country. What else? What else am I forgetting in here? Oh yeah, all discos and nightclubs were shut down in 2012, and every single shopping mall has the exact same name, Altan Asir. It's the same, just standardized, I guess. In 2016, energy drinks, dietary supplements, casinos, online gambling, massage parlors, pyrotechnics, or explosives for anyone who's curious with this, and even baby formula, these were all banned. Hypnotists, psychics, fortune tellers, and anyone who was a spiritualist was also banned. Basically, anyone who claimed to be able to predict the future or have some kind of insight into fate or some kind of higher power, banned, outlawed, gone. If you did claim to have these kinds of powers, then you could be sent to prison. Another law in Turkmenistan, only men above the age of 70 are allowed to keep a beard. Young men are not allowed to keep a beard or have long hair. Getting married even requires the blessing of the president, and every wedding photo better have his portrait displayed in the background prominently if he wasn't present for the event himself. One of the most bizarre laws in Turkmenistan is a law that bans lip syncing. Yeah, this law was created by Turkmenbashi, who believed that lip singing was a sign of moral decay. That law is still in effect to this day, and anyone who is caught lip singing can be fined or even imprisoned out in like a prison in the desert. So TikTok really would not function. And honestly, when I talk about this, there are so many more laws and other weird things that we could talk about. The problem is that many of them were instituted by one dictator, removed by another, modified by another again. The whole thing is really a mess. And the question then becomes, why is Turkmenistan like this? Well, for one, the people have been conditioned by propaganda and repression for literally decades. They also live in an information vacuum, and education is really not all that great. But the really crazy part about this is that some of the things that have been banned don't even have any laws written about them. There's just some things that the locals know you can't do because they've seen someone get hassled, arrested, or even worse for doing them. This is why that whole thing when I was talking about buildings and people having to remove their satellite dishes, yeah, when Birdie tried to eliminate those dishes because he wanted the front of buildings to look pretty, people started mounting them on the back of their building. And that same thing occurred with air conditioning units, and that in turn pissed off so many people because as the place gets really hot, as I already said, that's not something that people were just going to actually sit down and take. So the government, for once, actually did pull back on that issue. Anyway, this very unique country, this thing that we've talked about here this entire time, it's oftentimes overlooked by tourists, and for very good reasons. First of all, it's a closed country, and the dictatorship means that there is no real freedom of speech or expression. This is like North Korea or Eritrea, but worse at times. The citizens are continuously watched and punished for any kind of behaviors that are not in line with a dictator's doctrine. Human rights violations, including torture, arbitrary arrests, and detention, are all common practice. As is high corruption, rigged election, and closed borders for most citizens. You simply are not allowed to leave. Another thing is that the visa process to actually get to go to Turkmenistan is arduous, long, expensive, and it doesn't guarantee you that you're actually going to be able to get to go in the first place. Third, if you do somehow manage to get your visa approved, well, you need an invitation to go there and a guide to show you around. You're not allowed to see the country on your own, and these, as well as many other reasons, are why Turkmenistan is, to this day, one of the least visited countries in the world. And that brings us to the end of this video. What is Turkmenistan like now? Well, a change in leadership in Turkmenistan in 2022 did not lead to improvements in its human rights record. The country remained one of the most closed and repressive in the world. The government tolerates absolutely no political pluralism, no independent media, or non-governmental organizations. Authorities jail perceived opponents and government critics. The fate and whereabouts of dozens of victims of enforced disappearances remain unknown to this day. The government has failed to adequately address a worsening food security crisis, and freedom of movement is subject to substantial restrictions. Due to a lack of any reliable data of adequate quality, statistics of anything that we could talk about here, even despite everything that I have listed of poverty rates, food security, income, anything in Turkmenistan, this is something we don't know. The statistics, the data, it simply doesn't exist. Or, if it does exist, it's either heavily corrupted and influenced by the government, or we just can't get it in the first place. However, public reporting indicates that authorities' denial and inaction to address a worsening economic and food crisis, as well as increasing poverty, these have significantly exacerbated food insecurity. The availability for subsidized food staples has continued to shrink while prices have continued to rise. Bread shortages in state stores continue. Independent media outlets document shoppers queuing for hours just to access subsidized bread. In April of this year, it was reported that police in Ashgabat threatened to jail people for 15 days for purchasing more bread than they would be allotted under an uncodified rationing system. Back in February of this year, police would briefly detain customers for this, and they threatened to fine them for repeat violations. In January, police in Ashgabat had threatened to prosecute residents, mostly retired elderly people, after they had complained to the trade ministry about getting shortchanged on their subsidized food. And that problem is probably only going to get worse. The reality is that Turkmenistan is in the middle of a sustained economic crisis that has seen hyperinflation in the lives of ordinary people, and from that, widespread food shortages that show no signs of dropping. Oil and other resources have effectively been bought out by the higher powers within the state in order to siphon away any kind of wealth that they can possibly get. There is simply not enough food in the state-run shops, and so every morning, people have to line up for hours to buy staples such as flour, bread, or sugar, and there's simply not enough. Genuine checks on nepotism and conflicts of interest are lacking within the state. Corruption is widespread across the public sector and in everyday life. In 2023, there were reports of significant increases in the cost of bribes that would be needed for placing children in schools where foreign languages are taught. More bribes were also necessary for obtaining a passport, and for some people wishing to make the Hajj pilgrimage to Saudi Arabia, which is something that is even more terrible in a state that is still largely Muslim. There were also reports of families having to pay bribes in order to have their sons released from military service after serving the state-required 2-year term. So yes, if they didn't pay bribes to the government would not release their sons after they had already fulfilled their terms. Everything that I've talked about over the course of this video has lined up to keep Turkmenistan perennially at the bottom. Everything that I've talked about over the course of this video has all lined up to keep Turkmenistan permanently in the bottom 5 countries in the world on both the World Press Freedom Index and the Human Rights Watch Index for over 2 decades straight. And yet, still, the people of Turkmenistan have to carry on with life. At this point, there is nothing that has or can be done, and the only reports that we're able to get out of the country come from first-hand accounts, as there is simply no way to trust anything that comes from the state media. Much more could be said about this subject, and even when I am talking about this, I have skipped over many laws, many instances, many stories, many things that could be talked about. If you all would like to know more about this, if you want more videos on Turkmenistan or any of the individuals that we have talked about in the story, then by all means, let me know in the comment section below. But my friends, this has been Stakuyi with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. Thank you all very much for watching. I appreciate all of you. Without further ado, I'll see you next time. Goodbye, my friends.